Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Professor Kazuko Nakajima and Dr. Tomi Okatani for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I'm going to share my screen and use the PowerPoint, so it'll just take a moment to get that set up. So the title of my presentation is Bilingual Education Theories and Translanguaging Pedagogy, Implications for Language Policies and Instruction. The focus on translanguaging is because this term has become almost ubiquitous over the past 12 years or so. There are thousands of articles that have been published in the applied linguistics literature on the topic of translanguaging. And the focus on bilingual education is because bilingual education continues to expand in many countries, in some countries much more than others. But how bilingual education relates to typical traditional second language teaching is an issue that I want to address. So when we look at the presentation, I've divided it up into 4 parts. And these parts are basically drawing from my book, which came out last year, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, which was published by Multilingual Matters. And so initially what I want to do is provide a brief historical perspective on theoretical assumptions in second language teaching, just to give some context for what we're going to talk about. Part 2 will look at bilingual education issues. And the reality is that bilingual education, where 2 or sometimes more languages are used as mediums of instruction, rather than just being taught as a subject, this tends to work much better than traditional teaching of second languages as school subjects. However, there's some commonality of what I would regard as problematic assumptions in the implementation of bilingual programs in some contexts. And so understanding the nature of those problematic assumptions is really important in terms of thinking about what should be happening when we try to enable students to acquire additional languages. Part 3 will look at trends that have been happening over the last 15 years or so, where what has been called the multilingual turn has emerged. This is a focus on looking at teaching languages, not just from the point of view of adding a static second language to a first language that's also static, but rather looking at learners as multilinguals or potential multilinguals, where the 2 languages are interacting in important ways in our brains. And then finally, I'll try to look at what are the implications of this research and theory for second language teaching in Japan and elsewhere. So first of all, let's look historically in a very brief way to provide a sketch of what have been some of the theoretical assumptions in second language teaching. So I'm going to talk about 4 overlapping phases in second language teaching assumptions over the past 50 years or so. First of all is the grammar translation phase. I'm calling these phases rather than methods because they're sets of assumptions and they all overlap with each other, and there's still grammar translation teaching going on even as we speak today. But in grammar translation, students' first and second languages are brought into contact, but the focus is only on the structure of the language, and students typically remain passive rather than active in the learning process. They don't really do anything with the target language, and often the focus is on teaching the language so that students will be able to pass school examinations or national examinations. That grammar translation phase, or the assumptions underlying that, were challenged by what I'm calling the monolingual and 2 solitudes phase. The monolingual notion refers to teaching second languages as subjects, where the focus, or what's regarded as best practice, is trying to stay as much as possible in the target language as we teach that language, rather than reverting to using the first language. And this applies to both teachers and students. So the second language is typically taught in isolation from students' first language. And the term two solitudes is one that I've used to talk about some of the assumptions in bilingual education, or some forms of bilingual education and second language immersion, where the assumption has been that we should keep the two languages rigidly separate so that they don't interfere with each other, or so the first language will not interfere with the learning of the second language. I'm going to suggest that this is equally as problematic as the monolingual assumption in teaching languages as subjects. This has given rise over the past 15 or 20 years to what I'll call the cross-linguistic or plurilingualism phase. Plurilingualism is a term that has been used rather than multilingualism by the Council of Europe and by many European researchers. And I'll talk about the rationale for that and where that term comes from as we get into the presentation. But in this phase, or these sets of assumptions, regard students' first language as a resource for learning second language, and cross-linguistic contact and transfer are encouraged. So there's a focus on trying to bring the two languages, or all of students' languages, into productive contact with each other. And then finally, and more recently, over the past maybe 13, 14 years or so, there's been an increasing focus on translanguaging. And the major trend in translanguaging research and theoretical writing has come from the work of Professor Ophelia Garcia in New York City, and her colleagues. And they argue that languages cannot be distinguished in the student's cognitive system. And so it is illegitimate to talk about teaching for cross-linguistic transfer, because when you're talking about cross-linguistic transfer, you're assuming that there are two languages to transfer content and ideas across. But what I'm calling unitary translanguaging theory basically says there's only one linguistic system, one cognitive system, and languages, or what they call named languages, cannot really be distinguished within this system. I'm going to argue that this is going too far. There's very little evidence for this, and it's a problematic assumption. But this unitary translanguaging theory views it as legitimate to talk about languaging, in other words, the verb form, to language, but not languages in the noun form. So we can talk about languaging as being something that happens in our cognitive system, but languages as such do not exist in our cognitive system. So if you're feeling a little bit confused at what all this means for second language teaching, well, join the club. The current situation is confusing for many practitioners and also researchers. There's still a widespread belief that best practice requires teachers to use the target language exclusively in their teaching. And many people also believe that that native speakers of the target language are likely to be better teachers because their accent and fluency are what's regarded as native-like, and they're also more likely to use the second language exclusively in their teaching. And this belief is reflected in the fact that many language schools or language businesses in countries like Japan, Brazil, and many other places around the world advertise the fact that they employ native speaker staff. And so they set up a hierarchy between native speakers and non-native speakers of the language, or non-native teachers of the language, where it's assumed that the native speaker is superior. And again, many applied linguists have argued strongly against this assumption, but it's quite pervasive among many practitioners in the language teaching industry. So these beliefs have been challenged by research suggesting that there are strong relationships between students' first and second languages. And this suggests that we should teach for transfer across languages. And as I said earlier, the focus on translanguaging over the past decade or so goes even further in rejecting monolingual approaches to second language teaching. And then I mentioned that Ophelia Garcia's work and that of her colleagues even argues that languages do not exist in our cognitive system, and thus even teaching for cross-linguistic transfer is problematic. So how should we make sense out of all of these conflicting trends? Well, that's a question that I want to focus on in the presentation. So if we look, let's come back and look at monolingual or direct method assumptions. The direct method has been around for about 100 years or so, and it has argued that we should, or teachers should, use the target language to the exclusion of students' first language. And this is with the goal of enabling learners to think in the target language with minimal interference from the first language. And this principle initially gained widespread acceptance more than 100 years ago in the context of the direct method. And it still continues to exert a strong influence on various language teaching approaches since that time. For example, communicative language teaching, as it's implemented, often shares a lot of assumptions with direct method teaching. According to one of the people who reviewed this approach, the direct method imitated the way that children learn their first language, emphasizing the avoidance of translation and the direct use of the foreign language as the medium of instruction in all situations. And these assumptions were reflected in the audiolingual and audiovisual approaches that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. And they're also apparent in the implementation of communicative language teaching in many contemporary contexts. So if we look at the outcomes of second language teaching in many contexts, in general, what the research shows very clearly is that methods that teach the foreign language or the second language as a school subject, rather than using it as a medium of instruction, do not work well for most students, except when there's considerable exposure to English as a second language outside of school. For example, if students are engaging in English social media, if they're listening to English music, if they're watching English programs on television, then they're getting more exposure, and that can lead to considerable fluency in the language. And we see this in many countries in Northern Europe, such as the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, etc., where television programs are not dubbed into the language of the country. They're subtitled. So students are hearing English, and then they're reading the first language version or the home language version in the subtitle. And under those situations where there's considerable outside of school exposure to the second language, then the teaching of that language in school can work reasonably well. But when that exposure is not there, then the results are much more problematic. And for a large majority of students, they fail to gain any degree of fluency in the target language. They may do okay in examinations, but speaking the language fluently is usually beyond them, even after 6, 7, 8 years of instruction. And we see this in the Canadian context with the teaching of French as a second language, where when it's taught as a subject for 30 minutes a day or 40 minutes a day, students gain some degree of proficiency in the language, but they're typically, even after 5, 6, 7 years, unable to carry on a simple conversation in French. And we see that also in many other contexts where there is not outside of school exposure in a naturalistic context to the target language. Now, there are some students who are good language learners, who dedicate themselves, who are highly motivated, who will learn reasonably good degree of skills with this approach. But they're probably, on average, less than 20% of the students. For 80% of students, the results are disappointing. And this conclusion applies to whether we're talking about methods such as the grammar translation method, direct method, audiolingual method, communicative language teaching, and most other approaches that teach the foreign language or second language as a school subject. If we look at what has proven to be a much more successful approach, namely bilingual education, and I'm including second language immersion and CLIL, which is an acronym that stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning, as forms of bilingual education, because both second language immersion teaching and CLIL use the target language as a medium of instruction to teach other subjects for at least part of the school day. Second language immersion in the early stages typically will use the second language as a major medium of instruction in the early grades of primary or elementary school. CLIL typically starts in about grade 6 or 7 and will teach through the second language for maybe just one subject or sometimes two subjects. Bilingual education is implemented in countries such as the United States, parts of Canada, parts of Europe, is typically defined as programs that use at least 50% of the instruction through the target language or through each language. But despite the success of bilingual programs, the implementation of some bilingual programs and some second language immersion programs share that problematic monolingual instruction in terms of how the languages should be taught. And I'll try and elaborate on that in this part. So what does the research say about bilingual education? First of all, bilingual programs for both minority students, students whose home language is not the dominant language of the society, and students from the majority language group. Bilingual programs for both of these groups have been successfully implemented in countries around the world. And these, as I said, these programs generally produce much better outcomes than teaching the language just as a school subject. For minority groups, one of the realities is that students' home languages are fragile without strong support in the school and also in the community. Students will often not develop strong fluency and literacy in their home language. Typically, in a context like Toronto, where I live and work, where more than half of the students come from non-English speaking backgrounds, there are a large number of families and students from immigrant backgrounds. Students will come to school fluent in their home language, but within 2 or 3 years, they've stopped developing that language. And often by the end of elementary school, unless parents have had a strong policy of maintaining the language in the home, these students are often functionally monolingual in English. They've substituted the school language, the language of power, for their home language. And so one of the rationales for bilingual education for minority language groups is to help these students to continue to develop that home language and develop literacy in that language. And so in the United States, for example, many of the bilingual programs for Spanish speakers involve 50% of the time through Spanish and 50% of the time through English. And another finding from bilingual programs that is virtually universal, and this applies again to both minority and majority language students, is that there's no loss in students' mastery of the majority language, despite the fact that much less instructional time is spent through that language. Students typically catch up in reading and writing skills in the majority language by the later grades of primary school. However, academic skills in both languages must be actively taught. There will be some transfer of concepts across language that happens automatically, but the benefits of transfer will increase when schools teach actively for transfer across languages. And I'll try to provide the research evidence for that and draw out some of the implications for that also. Okay, let's take an example of a bilingual program, a second language immersion program in Japan, the Kadogakuin school experience of English immersion in the Japanese context. I'm drawing here from a doctoral dissertation that was written by the principal of the school, Michael Bostwick. You can see the information about his dissertation on the left-hand side of the screen. And I've included on the right-hand side some quotes from the dissertation that highlight some of the main aspects of the program and some of the findings. Bostwick says students, in describing the program, students would receive the same Japanese language instruction as non-immersion students, but all other classes would be done in English. This amounted to approximately 2/3 of the instructional day being conducted in English. So in other words, unlike many French immersion programs in Canada or Spanish immersion programs in the United States, the students' home language was taught from the beginning, and students spent the same amount of time in Japanese language arts, Japanese literacy instruction, as they would have in the mainstream program. But all other subjects were taught through English. Bostwick says, generally speaking, in terms of results, the immersion students performed at the same high level in all school subjects as the regular students who received all of their instruction in their primary language. And the results clearly demonstrate that there's no negative effect on primary language literacy skills. In other words, Japanese literacy skills, as measured by the national and prefectural Japanese achievement tests. The distance of the language pairs, in other words, the distance between Japanese and English, would appear to have little or no negative effect on primary language development within a partial immersion context. And he calls it a partial immersion program because Japanese is taught from the beginning of the program. With respect to their students' proficiency in English, he says, linguistically speaking, the grade 5 students were functioning in English at approximately the same level as third grade students in the United States. This is remarkable, considering that most of the students have never lived abroad. When we compare the immersion students to Japanese students in Japan in English language skills, as measured by the ICANN test, we find that a majority are performing at or beyond the ninth grade level. So in other words, the findings of this Japanese example parallel those that have been found for second language immersion in the United States, in Canada, and Ireland, and Wales, and other countries. Students develop much stronger levels of target language skills at no cost to their proficiency or literacy in their home language. And they don't lose out in terms of their knowledge of any subject matter that's taught through the second language. And Bostwick talks a little bit about why that might be the case. He talks about cognitive reprocessing, and he draws this concept from some of the remarks of both Lambert and Tucker, who evaluated the first French English immersion program in the Canadian context. This started in the mid-1960s in the Montreal area. And Wally Lambert and Richard Tucker, who authored the book of that evaluation, speculated that children may have transferred basic skills of reading, concept development, word manipulation, and verbal creativity through French to English by reprocessing in English all the information they received through French, or by simultaneously processing in French and English. So in other words, they speculate that one of the reasons students didn't lose out in terms of their knowledge of subject matter content, despite being taught that content through a weaker language, is that they were reprocessing that information in their home language. And so that consolidated their knowledge of the content at the same time as making it available in English. And then Andrew Cohen, who was involved in a number of the evaluations in the American context in the 1980s and 1990s, talked about the same concept in a study of math word problems in Spanish-English immersion programs. He says, this phenomenon of reprocessing is most likely what we uncovered in our study, where the reprocessing in English was of much, but not all of the information received through Spanish. And these are students whose home language is English. So this is a second language Spanish immersion program. So he says it's not so surprising that the students in this study switched to English to think through their word problems. After 6 or 7 years of immersion schooling, the learners were behaving externally or socially in Spanish, but not psychologically or cognitively. So in other words, even though they could speak Spanish and write in Spanish in the external world in terms of the work that they were doing in classrooms or reading a book, etc., inside, both languages were going on and both languages were connecting. And then Michael Bostwick, in his dissertation study of the English immersion program in Japan, says the transfer of skills learned through the medium of one language to another language has been seen over and over again in immersion programs around the world, and is clearly evident in the English immersion program in Japan. The transfer of concepts appears to be spontaneous. Evidence from these studies suggests that immersion students perform online reprocessing of the information into their primary language, and that the students' internal language environment is not nearly as foreign language oriented as outside observers might believe. So if we look at reviews of the research evidence on bilingual education, and there are thousands of studies that have been carried out since the 1960s on bilingual education in many parts of the world. I'll give you the conclusions of some of these large-scale reviews. One of them comes from a report of the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth that published its results in 2006. It was called Developing Literacy in Second Language Learners. And they reviewed all of the research evidence on bilingual education, particularly in the United States context. And they say, in summary, there's no indication that bilingual instruction impedes academic achievement in either the native language or English, whether for language minority students, students receiving heritage language instruction, or those enrolled in French immersion programs. Where differences were observed, on average, they favor the students in a bilingual program. The meta-analytic results clearly suggest a positive effect for bilingual instruction that's moderate in size. Another book that was published reviewing similar findings in the United States and elsewhere, where the main author was Fred Genesee and colleagues, they conclude that there's strong convergent evidence that the educational success of English language learners, in other words, minority language students in the United States, is positively related to sustained instruction through the student's first language. Most long-term studies report that the longer the students stayed in the program, the more positive were the outcomes. And finally, another large-scale study that published its conclusions in 2017 was published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, called Promoting the Educational Success of Children and Youth Learning English. One of their conclusions was syntheses of evaluation studies that compared the outcomes for English learners instructed in English-only programs with outcomes for English learners instructed bilingually find either that there's no difference in outcomes measured in English, or that English learners in bilingual programs outperform English learners instructed only in English. And studies that have come out in the past 5 or 6 years reinforce this conclusion. They point out that 2 recent studies that follow students for sufficient time to gauge longer-term effects of language of instruction on English learner outcomes find benefits for bilingual compared to English-only approaches. But many immersion and bilingual education programs have also bought into the assumption that the 2 languages should be kept separate. And I've called this claim the 2 solitudes claim. And this basically says that the L1 and L2 should be isolated from each other in the learning process to the extent possible, in order to ensure that the first language doesn't interfere with the learning of the second language. The opposite claim, the one that I would endorse, is the cross-linguistic transfer claim. And that's the claim that second language immersion and bilingual programs will be even more successful when teachers systematically encourage students to bring the two languages into productive contact. This teaching for transfer will enhance cross-linguistic processing and build students' awareness of similarities and differences between their languages. Now, the two solitudes claim, or the monolingual principle, was very clearly articulated by Wallace Lambert, who was the most prominent researcher who evaluated second language immersion programs, French immersion programs, in the 1960s and 70s and beyond. And he says in one of his articles, no bilingual skills are required of the teacher who plays the role of a monolingual in the target language and who never switches languages, reviews materials in the other language, or otherwise uses the child's native language in teacher-pupil interactions. In immersion programs, therefore, bilingualism is developed through two separate monolingual instructional routes. What this is saying essentially is that in a second language immersion program, or more broadly a bilingual program, the two languages should be kept rigidly separate. The target language should be used exclusively by the teacher with no switching between languages. In the past the early grades in French immersion programs and some of the Spanish immersion programs in the United States, obviously students' home language is taught, but typically it'll be taught by a different teacher, or if it's taught by the same teacher, the teacher will use only that language in teaching students' home language, in other words, English, and only Spanish or French in teaching the target language. So again, there should be no switching between languages. And finally, translation across languages is never viewed as appropriate within this set of assumptions. Now, what's wrong with this monolingual principle? Well, I've argued, and other people have argued, for example, the work of Ophelia Garcia has been very clear on this, that this orientation has led to restrictive pedagogical possibilities, with very little opportunity for students to showcase their growing intellectual and literacy skills in the two languages. Because their languages are kept in isolation from each other, teachers don't point to relationships between the two languages. Now, in Japanese and English, there may be far fewer relationships than between, say, Spanish and English or French and English, but still there are ways in which the teaching of one language can be aligned or connected to the other. For example, if we're talking about strategies for writing coherent essays, teaching students when you make a paragraph in your essay can be connected up across languages. And so there can be alignment that takes place across languages. And again, because within the two solitudes assumption, there's no such thing as writing dual language books or using both languages in carrying out classroom projects or classroom activities, because this would involve translation. And so some of the classroom experiences that bilingual children have been encouraged to do, and activities they've been encouraged to do, have just not been happening to the same extent in French immersion programs because of keeping the two languages separate. And generally, teachers don't promote students' awareness of how language works, for example, by contrasting grammatical patterns in first and second languages. So the criticism of the two solitudes approach is that it's missing out on opportunities to bring the two languages into productive contact, and to also to make the reprocessing process that students go through as they're learning content through a second language, to make that even more efficient than it is already. Okay, part 3. What do we mean by the multilingual turn and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer? So there have been several books that have used the phrase the multilingual turn. And you see a couple of them on the screen there. And this is basically arguing that language teaching should take account of the fact that multilingualism is increasingly the norm in societies around the world. And rather than assuming that all language learners are monolingual and we're adding a second language to a static first language, we should be looking at the dynamic interactions and connections across languages. So various terms have been used to talk about translanguaging pedagogy or cross-linguistic pedagogies. For example, translanguaging has been used, heteroglossic instructional orientation has been used, the multilingual turn, plurilingual pedagogy is used extensively in the European context. I've used the term bilingual instructional strategies. Others have talked about interlingual teaching, where the focus is on connecting the two languages and teaching for transfer across languages. And all of these strategies have in common a rejection of the two solitudes orientation to bilingual proficiency and a commitment to teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. And these strategies can be applied not only in bilingual education or second language immersion contexts, but also in multilingual context where the dominant language is used for instructional purposes. And I'll give you some examples of that. So if we look at the notion of plurilingualism, as I said, this term has come to prominence as a result of the work of the Council of Europe in the European context. And many researchers in Europe use plurilingualism rather than multilingualism in talking about knowledge of more than one language. I'm not going to get into whether there's really a difference between those terms or not, but we should be aware that that is a term that's used in the European context predominantly, whereas multilingualism continues to be used predominantly in the North American context. And the researchers elaborated this concept of plurilingualism to refer to the dynamically integrated and intersecting nature of the linguistic repertoires of bilingual and plurilingual individuals. My colleague Enrique Picardo expressed the instructional implications of this theoretical assumption of sets of assumptions as follows. A plurilingual classroom is one in which teachers and students pursue an educational strategy of embracing and exploiting the linguistic diversity present in order to maximize communication and promote both subject learning and plurilingual and pluricultural awareness. In other words, teachers should aim to bring the target language into productive contact with students' home languages. Now, I've used the term cross-linguistic pedagogy, which I base on the notion of a common underlying proficiency, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I argue that teachers should teach for transfer across languages. In subsequent work that I carried out with my colleague, Margaret Early, we also highlighted the role of identity affirmation and identity negotiation in the language learning process. And the point here was that when students are enabled to create what we called identity texts, they can showcase their growing competence in their two or more languages. And then their identities are affirmed as bilinguals, as multilinguals. And this is going to fuel further engagement with learning the language. And the bottom line here is that identity affirmation, taking ownership of the language as part of you, that comes from doing what I'm calling powerful things with language or languages. So I'll try and elaborate on these notions in the next few slides. So what is the common underlying proficiency notion? This comes from looking at the research on bilingual education from the 1970s on. I suggested this notion of a common underlying proficiency or linguistic interdependence to account for the fact that studies of bilingual education and second language immersion showed strong relationships between literacy skills and things like vocabulary knowledge in students' home language and their second language, particularly as students went up to grade levels of primary or elementary school. And so this suggested that even though what I call the surface features of the two languages were separate or could be distinguished, at a deeper level, at the level of cognitive and linguistic processing, there's a lot of overlap or interdependence across languages. And I use the metaphor of an iceberg, where if we think about an iceberg, we know that what we see above the surface is only a small fraction of what's beneath the surface. And an applied linguist called Roger Shuy, S-H-U-Y, suggested back in the 1970s that language proficiency is kind of like an iceberg, where what's much more important for doing well in school or for processing more complex linguistic input is below the surface, and very different from what we see above the surface in terms of things like accent, fluency, etc. And so I took this notion and said, we can view bilingualism and by extension multilingualism as a double iceberg, where even though the surface features are distinguishable, there's commonality at a deeper level. Not all aspects will transfer across languages, but there many aspects will, particularly conceptual development. So there's overlap and dynamic interdependence among languages. There's a really, I think, powerful and informative metaphor that was suggested a few years ago by a New Zealand researcher, Sophie Tawai-Tamati, in her doctoral dissertation. She used the metaphor, the visual metaphor of a tree that's native to New Zealand, the Kaikatea tree. And this is a tree that grows in very swampy, marshy soil. And so in order to gain strength, the roots of the trees spread out horizontally and they bind together with each other. So that even though we can distinguish individual trees above the surface, as you can see in the left, at a deeper level, there's a lot of dynamic interconnectedness, dynamic interdependence amongst all the trees. And Tamati makes the point that our languages are like this, that at a deeper level, there's a lot of interconnectedness, dynamism going on below the surface with our linguistic knowledge. And this has been reinforced by neurological studies of the brain, as well as cognitive studies looking at how languages interact. And so these two metaphors are, I think, pointing to the same thing. I think the Kaikatea tree metaphor is more vivid and better captures the dynamic interactions among languages than the iceberg metaphor. But the iceberg metaphor was designed to try and account for the research findings that there's a lot of relationship, strong correlations across languages when it comes to literacy-related skills, and also the fact that students in bilingual programs can spend 50% or more of their instructional time through a minority language without any negative consequences for the development of their skills in the dominant language. So both are I think, valid and aimed at explaining slightly different data, but they're pointing to the same set of phenomena. So when we look at the research support for this, there's a huge amount of research support, as I mentioned. We can go back to that same study, the consensus study of language learning and educational success for children learning English in the United States context, written by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States. And they point out the findings of research show that research dating back to the 1960s reveals that the two languages of bilinguals do not exist in isolation, and to the contrary, are highly interactive. The two languages of bilinguals share a cognitive conceptual foundation that can facilitate the acquisition and use of more than one language for communication, thinking, and problem solving. And the other conclusions basically elaborate on that. So there's strong empirical report for the notion of a common underlying proficiency and the reality of transfer across languages. We can see that in qualitative studies also. The book that I edited with Margaret Early looked at some of the experiences of students who are learning English. These were students from English-owned backgrounds who were in schools where the medium of instruction was exclusively English. There were students from many different language backgrounds. Most teachers didn't have any knowledge of the languages of their students. But some of the teachers managed to bring students' languages into the classroom in powerful ways. Students like Lisa Leone, the teacher in this situation, encouraged students to carry out projects in both of the languages. She encouraged them when they were writing assignments or writing stories to write initially in their first language and then to go from that first language to English. She found ways of helping them translate from one language to another. It might be a teacher in the school who spoke their languages. Sometimes electronic means were used to get a starting point in the translation, and then teachers and other students help students edit what they'd written in their first language into English, or edit the English version of that. So the result was a bilingual dual language book. But listen to what some of the students said in terms of their experience of using their first language as they were learning English. So Amina wrote, and this was just after her first year of learning English. She says, when I'm allowed to use my first language in class, it helps me with my writing and reading of English. Because if I translation in English to Urdu, then Urdu give me help for English language. I also think better and write more in English when I use Urdu, because I can see in Urdu what I want to say in English. So in other words, she's pointing to the two languages interacting in powerful and productive ways in her head. And Hira makes essentially the same point when she says, when I'm allowed to use Urdu in class, it helps me because when I write in Urdu and then I look at Urdu words and English comes in my mind. So it helps me a lot. When I write in English, Urdu comes in my mind. When I write in English, I say it in Urdu in my mind. When I read in Urdu, I feel very comfortable because I can understand it. So their teacher, Lisa Leone, consistently encouraged her students to carry out creative writing and other assignments in their home language, and generally use their home language as a stepping stone to English. When we look at what happened here when students wrote dual language books, and there are many examples of this in Lisa's class and the classes of other teachers in this project. The term that we used to talk about this was identity texts. And this term comes from the fact that we were trying to describe the products of students' creative work or performances, which were carried out in the pedagogical space orchestrated by the classroom teacher. And in this pedagogical space, obviously learning is happening, hopefully learning is happening, but also identities are being negotiated. When we're talking about immigrant background students, if the teacher prohibits students or punishes them for speaking their home language and says the classroom is an English-only zone or a Japanese-only zone, that's not just a cognitive message to students about what language they can use. It's also a message about their identity. Their home language has no place within the culture of the school. And that's a rejection, not only of the child's language, but also of the child himself or herself, even though it may not be an intentional rejection. But in the context where students are encouraged to use their first language, they invest their identities in the creation of these identity texts. And we're using the word text in a broad sense. They can be written, they can be spoken, they can be visual, they can be musical, dramatic, or combinations in multimodal form. They could be a video that students create. They can be any production, any product, artifact, where students invest their identities in creating it. And then once the text is out there, either in whatever form it is written, if it's a dual language book, in hard copy or up in the web, then it holds a mirror up to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive way. And when students share identity texts with multiple audiences, for example, their classmates, their teachers, parents, grandparents, if they're connected online to a sister class in another country, for example, if the media pick up on some of these things and highlight work that students are doing in 2 languages, all of this sharing with multiple audiences is likely to generate positive feedback for the students and affirmation of self in interaction with these audiences. So the second language and literacy in the second language is being connected with an expansion of identity, positive expansion of identity. And this in turn fuels further literacy engagement. So let me give you an example. This again was in Lisa Leone's class. This was a grade 6 class. Tomer was a student who had arrived about a year previously from Israel, and he'd grown up in an agricultural context in Israel. He knew a lot about horses and was very much somebody who was passionate about horses. And so when the teacher asked the students to write a story, it could be any kind of a story or anything that they wanted to write about, this was part of the curriculum requirements for all grade 6 students. Grade 6 would be about age 12. She knew that if Tomer were confined only to writing in English, he wouldn't be able to write very much. He was only in his first year of learning English. But if he could write in his first language, then he could show much more what his literacy skills were, what his ideas were, what he wanted to communicate with his classmates and with teachers and others. And so she encouraged him to write in his first language. And then there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help him translate what he had written into English. And the result is a dual language book. And Tomer was a very insightful young man. Here's what he said about using the first language. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. And unfortunately, a lot of immigrant students have felt like this in many countries around the world. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. So what he's talking about here is this dynamic interaction across languages, where the 2 languages come into productive contact as they're engaged in writing this dual language book. Tomer went on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what Lisa, his teacher, was saying, except the word Hebrew. But I think it's very smart that she said for us to do it in our language, because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. And so if we look at what's happening here with this dual language book, the teacher is encouraging students to bring their first and second language into productive contact. There's scaffolding of second language academic language learning through initial L1 writing. If you had given Tomer the English version of a story, what ended up as the English version of a story, if you had given him that before he had written it, he would not have been able to read it. But after he had written it, he was able to read it because he had translated it. He had created it with the teacher who helped him do the translation. So there was an enormous amount of language learning going on in this process. The Tomer was actively engaged with literacy, and there's a huge amount of research out there showing that literacy engagement is a powerful instructional strategy for expanding students' second language skills, as well as expanding their first language skills when they're reading in their first language. It's connecting instruction to students' lives, and it's affirming their sense of identity. So rather than just being the English as a second language student in terms of their identity placement within the school, a student who doesn't know English that well, suddenly Tomer is the proud author of a really engaging, interesting book written in his 2 languages. So he was able to showcase his knowledge of the 2 languages and is developing his emerging literacy in both of those languages. He sent the Hebrew version of the story back online to his friends back in Israel. Said, check out the website. My story is up there, and I'm really proud of it. So what transfers across language? When we're talking about cross-linguistic transfer, what exactly are we talking about? It's going to vary from one context to another, but in general, what we see is transfer of concepts. For example, if a child or a student has come from another country, let's say a Brazilian student has come from Brazil to Japan at age 10, 11, 12, and in science, that student has already learned about photosynthesis. He or she understands that concept. They don't have to relearn that concept all over again. They've got the concept. They need to learn how to talk about that concept in Japanese. Depending on the languages, there may be some transfer of specific linguistic elements. For example, in many languages, the meaning of photo, that prefix in the word photosynthesis, will be similar because it comes from the Greek for light. There'll be transfer of phonological awareness across many languages, knowledge that words are made up of different sounds. There's, depending on the languages, again, there may be transfer of morphological awareness, how words are formed, for example, roots, prefixes, suffixes, etc., in a language like English. There may be transfer of cognitive and linguistic strategies for example, understanding text, strategies of visualizing, use of graphic organizers, mnemonic devices, vocabulary acquisition strategies, etc. So it's not just linguistic elements that are transferring when we talk about interdependence. Okay, let's move on to translanguaging, which is one form or one term that's being used to talk about cross-linguistic pedagogy. So the way I'm using this term, my definition of it, which varies a little bit from the definition of some other people, but I'm defining it as by saying that pedagogical translanguaging refers to instruction designed to enable students to use their entire multilingual repertoire in carrying out academic tasks and activities. Now, the term is new, but the reality is not. Teachers in many contexts were engaging in this kind of instruction long before the term translanguaging entered mainstream educational discourse, and there's a variety of references there. However, the elaboration of the concept by Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues in the late 2000s, and the development of a wide range of instructional and curricular resources that Garcia and her colleagues initiated, that has dramatically increased awareness of the potential of translanguaging pedagogy and has stimulated exploration of its classroom possibilities. And this is particularly the case in international school contexts. Where did the term translanguaging come from? Well, the origin of it was in Welsh-English bilingual education. Ken Williams, whom you see on the left of the screen, initially coined the term to reference the systematic and intentional alternation of input and output languages in Welsh-English bilingual instruction. So, for example, a concept might be taught in Welsh, but then students, like let's say a concept like photosynthesis, but then students might go home and for an assignment, do more research in photosynthesis. They're likely to find much more material on this in English than in Welsh. And so the content is taught in Welsh, but then students might write about it in English, they might read about it in English, and then come back and talk about it in Welsh. So you've got switching between languages in a systematic way. And the research, Welsh researchers, Lewis, Jones, and Baker talked about pedagogical translanguaging as allowing more effective learning due to cross-language semantic remapping that occurs when the encoded information in one language is retrieved to enable production in the other language. So this is a little bit like the cross-linguistic reprocessing that we talked about earlier on. Now, the variation of translanguaging theory that Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues have promoted has been called unitary translanguaging theory. And in her book, Bilingual Education in the 21st Century, Garcia elaborated on this. And since that time, there have been probably thousands of articles talking about translanguaging, based largely on the work of Ophelia Garcia. So I'm calling this UTT, Unitary Translanguaging Theory. And the central claim of this is that the multilingual's linguistic system is internally unitary and undifferentiated, so you can't divide it up. And this reflects the fact that, according to Garcia and colleagues, languages have no linguistic or cognitive reality. Languages have social reality, and to acknowledge this, Garcia and colleagues call them named languages. But they do that to highlight the fact that they're just names. They don't really have reality inside our heads. But UTT goes further than just claiming that our internal cognitive system is linguistically undifferentiated. They also reject several key theoretical concepts associated with cross-linguistic pedagogy, such as a common underlying proficiency. They reject teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. They reject notions of additive bilingualism, where teachers try to encourage students to add the dominant language to their home language while encouraging both languages to continue developing. They reject the notion of academic language as something that can be distinguished from conversational language. So because languages don't exist in our cognitive system, then it's meaningless to talk about teaching for transfer across languages. Unitary translanguaging theory also rejects the concept of code switching. And there have been some very interesting exchanges between Jeff McSwan, an American applied linguist, and Ophelia Garcia and colleagues about this issue, which I'm not going to talk about because my focus here is on pedagogical translanguaging. So here are the claims. I've mentioned most of them before. I'll go through it very quickly. As I said before, they claim that the verb form languaging or translanguaging is legitimate, but the noun form languages is illegitimate. They regard code switching as an illegitimate monoglossic construct because it assumes the existence of two separate linguistic systems. They reject additive bilingualism because it similarly assumes the existence of two separate languages that are added together in bilingual individuals. They also reject a common underlying proficiency and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer because these, again, they claim imply a monoglossic conception of bilingualism. And then some members of Ophelia Garcia's team and co-researchers argued that academic language is a racial-linguistic ideology that frames racialized students as linguistically deficient and in need of remediation. And they also reject additive approaches to minoritized students' bilingualism as being rooted in racial linguistic ideologies. I don't have time to get into all of these issues here in this presentation, but you can see that within unitary translanguaging theories, there's a lot of strong statements made. I analyze these issues in quite a bit of depth in the book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Students. But here I'm just going to focus in on the central claim of Ophelia Garcia and colleagues that the bilingual's linguistic system is unitary and undifferentiated, because all of the other arguments that they make come from this central claim. I've argued that instead of unitary translanguaging theory, we should be talking about cross-linguistic translanguaging theory. So in other words, I'm not rejecting the concept of translanguaging, but I'm saying that we can retain the notion that languages do have existential reality within our brains, while at the same time endorsing dynamic interactions across languages in our cognitive system. So cross-linguistic translanguaging theory affirms the existential reality of languages in the individual's cognitive and linguistic system. CTT also endorses additive bilingualism, academic language, and the legitimacy of teaching for transfer across languages. It argues that languages intersect and interact in dynamic ways in the cognitive and linguistic functioning of the individual. And these concepts are 100% consistent with dynamic conceptions of multilingualism. So there are some clear differences between unitary translanguaging theory and cross-linguistic translanguaging theory. And these can be put to the empirical test. But the fact that there are very different claims and very different orientation to the legitimacy of the notion of language should not obscure the fact that there is a lot of commonality and overlap between cross-linguistic translanguaging theory and unitary translanguaging theory. Both perspectives view languages as socially constructed. They reject rigid instructional separation of languages. They condemn the frequent evaluation of the linguistic practices that many minoritized students bring to school. Both orientations to translanguaging also endorse dynamic conceptions of multilingual cognitive functioning. And both view translanguaging pedagogy that connects with students' lives and draws on their entire linguistic repertoire as a central component in the struggle for social justice and equity in education. So just to sum up, the core difference between cross-linguistic translanguaging theory and unitary translanguaging theory is that cross-linguistic translanguaging theory proposes fluid linguistic and cognitive boundaries between languages. Unitary translanguaging theory proposes no boundaries and no languages. In other words, for a Japanese-English bilingual, it's not possible to distinguish Japanese from English in the individual's linguistic or cognitive system. So in the book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, I analyze these opposing claims in terms of the empirical evidence, the extent to which they're logically coherent, and the extent to which they're conducive to the implementation of effective and empowering multilingual instructional practices. So I'm just going to look briefly at one aspect of the empirical evidence, just to illustrate what this analytic process might look like. This comes from an article, in fact, there's two articles that Rakesh Bhatt and Agnes Bologna have authored, challenging the claims of unitary translanguaging theory. They review compelling data from studies of aphasia, demonstrating that the different languages of bilinguals have specific patterns of neural representation and organization. As one example, they cite the case of JZ, a Basque Spanish bilingual individual with aphasia, whose linguistic functioning in each language was affected in markedly different ways by his aphasia. And the point here is that they're making is that the two languages do have neurological reality, they do have cognitive reality, because otherwise you wouldn't see this differentiation in the impact of aphasia on the two languages. They say JZ's aphasia impacted his languages to different degrees. His first language, Basque, was more impaired than his second language, Spanish. In particular, the bilingual aphasia test revealed deficits in first language production, but intact production in a second language. Such differential language loss does not find an account in translanguaging theory. A unitary linguistic system cannot explain why one language is impacted more than another in differential bilingual aphasia. Now, that conclusion applies very clearly to unitary translanguaging theory, but it doesn't apply to cross-linguistic translanguaging theory because it's totally consistent with what cross-linguistic translanguaging theory is claiming, that the languages do have linguistic reality in our brains. Okay, finally, the last part. How do we pull all of this together? What are some of the implications of this research and theory for second language teaching in Japan and elsewhere? So some of the conclusions are that active engagement with the target language, both in oral and written forms, and identity investment in learning the target language strongly promote effective learning. The goal should be to enable students to do powerful, in other words, identity-affirming things with the target language, such as writing dual language books, such as using both languages in a research project that they might have done, where the students have created a PowerPoint to talk about, for example, the different systems of the human body, that they could label these systems in multiple languages in addition to just the school language. Finding ways to show and to enable students to showcase their knowledge of the first language, so that they're not just seen as students who are deficient in the school language. They're not just positioned as language learners who need support. They're positioned as emergent bilinguals who are developing, who have knowledge of more than one language, and who are developing proficiency in the school language as they continue to develop their first language. That affirms identity, and that promotes more engagement with learning the target language, the school language. The second point is that students' home language acts as a foundation for second language development. So teaching for cross-linguistic transfer of concepts and literacy skills represents a powerful instructional strategy. And a wide variety of instructional strategies have been implemented for bringing the language learners to languages into productive contact. The last chapter of my book is about 50 or 60 pages full of these kinds of examples that have been implemented over the last 20 or 30 years. As I said, this strategy has recently been termed pedagogical translanguaging. I have no problems with that term, but it's referring to a phenomenon that we've been aware of for many years, and teachers have, in still a relatively small number of contexts, have been doing pedagogical translanguaging, even though they have not used that term. And I'll just illustrate this with, again, a Japanese example very briefly. And this is the research of Professor Junko Majima and her colleagues in Osaka. And this highlights what can be done, even in contexts where there's a fairly, I won't say rigid, but fairly inflexible school system in terms of teacher autonomy in comparison to a country like Canada. And what I want to say here is that what the research of Professor Majima and colleagues have highlighted is what has been called the language-friendly school movement. And this is a term that a colleague of mine in Toronto, Emmanuelle Pichon, and a colleague of hers in the Netherlands coined to talk about the way we should be approaching the teaching of multilingual students. You can find out more about it by going to the website. But the point here is that the whole school adopts an orientation of promoting language awareness about all of the languages that are represented in the school. Students are encouraged to carry out projects in their home language. We see a lot of different languages on the corridors and the walls of classrooms and schools. And there's a general celebration of the linguistic and multilingual fluency and competence of all of the students in the school. So the whole point of the language-friendly schools movement is to transform our schools into language-friendly ecosystems, where students' home languages are recognized and affirmed, where all students can expand their identities as they become aware of how language works, both in our heads, in our families, and in our society. In other words, how language works cognitively for us, as well as socially in our networks, and where students can begin to use their entire multilingual repertoire for powerful identity-affirming purposes. So this is pedagogical translanguaging, if you want to use those terms. Language-friendly schools is a very attractive term also to think about this in terms of developing whole school policies. And this is exactly what Professor Majima's longitudinal study over a 10-year period documented in the Japanese context. You can see a book that Professor Majima and her colleagues published in English, and also articles that they have written in English. And I'm sure this work has also been published in Japanese. So they conducted a longitudinal study by following a total of 110 pupils to assess their bilingual proficiency in home language Chinese and second language Japanese. I'm not going to go through all of the characteristics of the study. Many of you may be already very familiar with this. You can see some of the examples of what they did over the 10-year period on the left-hand side. But Chinese was taught. There was a teacher hired by the school who's a Chinese native speaker who worked with the students and other teachers to transform the school into a language-friendly ecosystem, even though that term was not used in the actual study. But in terms of quantitative findings, children attain native-like fluency in Japanese spoken skills faster than they catch up academically in Japanese reading skills. So again, this is a finding that's been reported in many contexts. It takes longer to catch up in second language literacy skills and academic language skills than it does in everyday spoken language skills. And the researchers point out that many of these children will require support from teachers for several years after they appear to have learned Japanese. So that's a really important finding, and replicates findings in Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, and elsewhere. But what they also found is that children who developed Chinese reading skills, in addition to conversational and listening skills, performed significantly better in Japanese reading than those who had attained conversational and or listening Chinese skills, but not literate Chinese skills. This is pointing in exactly the same direction as other studies, suggesting that when children develop an additive form of bilingualism, where they add a second language, in this case Japanese, to their repertoire of skills, while at the same time continuing to develop literacy in their home language, this has positive cognitive consequences for the students. So to wrap up, some conclusions. So despite its dominance in foreign language teaching, the teaching of immigrant background students, and even in bilingual and second language immersion programs, monolingual instructional assumptions are not supported by the empirical data and have generally produced disappointing results in practice. The monolingual principle and the two solitudes assumption ignore the dynamic interactions between languages in the individual's cognitive system. And when teachers promote that productive contact between languages, the spontaneous transfer that's occurring is enhanced. A second point is, I believe translanguaging is a useful concept to highlight the dynamic interconnections between languages, both in the process of learning languages and using languages. Pedagogical translanguaging, understood as enabling students to make use of their full multilingual or plurilingual repertoire in carrying out academic tasks and activities. This is supported by the empirical research and examples, and it's also supported by examples of classroom practice where students pursue productive contact between languages. And as I said before, I've labeled this version of translanguaging cross-linguistic translanguaging theory. Unitary translanguaging theory, as promoted by Professor Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues, overlaps with cross-linguistic translanguaging theory in many ways, but it loses credibility in my eyes and the eyes of some other researchers as a result of its empirically unsupported claim that languages have no cognitive reality. This claim leads unitary translanguaging theorists to reject useful and empirically supported concepts such as the common underlying proficiency, additive bilingualism, and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. So I've included in the PowerPoint, which you'll have access to, some websites where more examples and a lot of concrete examples of translanguaging pedagogy, language-friendly schools pedagogy, cross-linguistic pedagogy, call it what you will. You can find a lot of examples of these directions at these sites. So again, I'd like to express my appreciation to Professor Nakajima, Professor Tomi Yukutani for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to having the opportunity to answer some of the questions that may come up as a result of the presentation. So thank you.